Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unraveling Politics. This is a show where we talk about the political news of the day, and I provide my analysis. So, there's not as much that happened this week that I think is relevant to us, but I still think there's some good things to talk about. I want to leave where we left off with at the last episode where we talked about President Trump's potential vice presidential pick. Here's some statements from some of his potential people that he may be picking. Senator J.D. Vance said that he had spoken to the Trump team, but not to Trump directly about it, and that he was focused on the people of Ohio. Governor Doug Burgum said he defers any questions back to the Trump campaign team. Tom Cotton said, I think there's only one person who knows who's on the short list, and that would be former President Trump. And Trump said he will reveal the name at the convention, which will be next month in Milwaukee. So, Trump has also said when he visited Congress, because he visited Congress this week for the first time since the January 6th attack, really since the first time he was president, Trump said that his vice president was probably in the room during the meeting. So this would include the people I mentioned, the three of them, as well as Elise Stefanik and Byron Donalds. So that statement from Trump doesn't really reveal any extra people. It could also be, as I said last episode, Marco Rubio or Tim Scott. My guess is it would be Marco Rubio. But really any of these names are possible, except Doug Burgum. I don't see that happening. J.D. Vance does have some advantage that he's from Rust Belt region, but Ohio is not a presidential battleground anymore, and hasn't really been for about 10 years now. So, that is something to keep in mind. As we look forward, there will be a debate coming up in about a week on the 27th. So that is something that we need to watch, and it's going to be a little bit odd because presidential debates don't usually happen until September or October. So this will actually be before Trump and Biden are the official nominees for their party, and it's going to be before we even have a vice president for Trump. So who knows? Next, I also want to talk about the G7 meeting. This has been at an interesting time. I saw a very good headline. It said that the G7 is meeting at a time when their political power at home is weakened. There's going to be elections this year in the U.S., U.K., and France, and in Canada, Justin Trudeau's party is well behind in the polls. Schultz and Macron were defeated in European Union elections, and in Japan, the party has been beset by corruption. The party of, I don't even know how to pronounce that, Fumio Kishida. Only Giorgia Meloni of Italy was boosted by the European Union elections. So Biden, of course, has been saying that America's back. That's been kind of his thing for the last 3 years. However, a lot of Europeans, from what I gather, especially European politicians, are very wary of a Trump return to the presidency because Trump has considered withdrawing from NATO, and he would pursue a more isolationist approach. So that's something the Europeans, if I were them, I would be preparing for, and I think some of them are. I do know the British have been doing some talks with the Trump team. Macron has been urging that the Europeans need to not get bogged down by American issues. And one good example of that is us as Americans. Our foreign policy has always been more Middle Eastern based, while their foreign policy has been more concerned with Russia. So then you can kind of see that playing out in real time, because while a lot of our media attention has been on the Middle East and Gaza, and I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more later, they're more concerned about Russia and the war in Ukraine, which is obviously understandable. The war in Ukraine is not as much of a political issue here anymore as it was really before the war in Gaza started. So that is probably a good thing for Ukraine, in that Republicans are not really focused as much on Ukraine. Democrats are obviously more divided on Gaza than they were on Ukraine. So that's probably a good thing for Ukraine. However, it has taken attention away from them. Speaking of which, though, our allies, the G7, has agreed to lend Ukraine $50 billion in frozen Russian asset profits. And, of course, there was a Russian nuclear submarine, 4 of them, that were found off the coast of Florida Wednesday night, and they're 100 miles away from Florida. So that's deeply concerning. They're doing military exercises. hopefully the Biden administration's on top of that. Considering what has happened in recent years, I'm not very optimistic, especially after what's happened in Afghanistan, and we were basically blindsided by the war in Ukraine. So that's something that I'm deeply concerned about, is that they are right on our shores. And speaking of which, something that the Trump team's going to have to be concerned about is that Biden has committed to defending Ukraine for the next 10 years, and I don't think that's a treaty that we can easily just reverse. That depends on who. If it's a treaty, it has to be approved by the Senate. If it's just an agreement, I could see Trump being able to just veto it, or just kind of U-turn. So that's going to be really important. The G7 will meet again in June 2025 in Canada. So by then, there will almost certainly be a new British Prime Minister, and there may be a new American president. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. I also want to talk about what's super important is that right after the last episode released, there was elections, it was as I was filming the last episode, so I couldn't talk about it. There were elections in Europe for the European Parliament. These were the first in 5 years. A third of the EU Parliament will be far right. However, they're split into factions, and they made gains in France and Germany. So this kind of shows the reaction to COVID and inflation. The left suffered severe losses. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was bad, and there has clearly been a rise of nationalism in Europe. Now, I wrote a paper my sophomore year of college about Euroscepticism in the EU. So it's not something, and the takeaway has always been that the far right has been too deeply divided to achieve anything, because they can't work together. You think about it, how easy is it to get an international group of nationalists? So the implications we have here is there's clearly been, at least in the West, a rise of nationalism. We've seen that in Canada. We've seen that like Canada, the Conservatives are doing very well in the polls there. In America, obviously, Trump has been leading in the polls, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And of course, in Europe, as we just had the elections that we just talked about. So that is something I definitely want to keep in mind in the future. Now, as for the political polling I was referring to earlier, so as of Thursday, 5:38 had Trump and Biden tied at 40% and Robert Kennedy at 9%. President Biden's job approval is 38.7%, and the favorable view of Trump was just a little bit higher at 41.4%. On Real Clear Politics, which is what I generally use, President Biden's job approval was 1% higher than on 538, 39.7. As of May 30th, Trump had 47.6% of the polls. Biden had 46.7%, so Trump had a 0.9% lead. Since then, both Trump and Biden have lost about 2% of their support. Trump has a narrow lead, but it's not by much. It's by about 0.5%. So that's within the margin of error. Even after the conviction, there has basically been no movement in the polls. If you include all of the presidential candidates, now normally, I said in the last episode, I generally don't do this. Trump is at 42.6%, Biden is at 39.7%, Kennedy is at 7.4%, Stein is at 1.6%, and Cornel West, the independent socialist, is at 1.3%. And of course, when you include Kennedy is now on the ballot in Nebraska, and that's important for the 2nd Congressional District, Michigan, Nevada, New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Ohio. So these are states he's on. And of course he's in other states, but I only wanted to talk about only wanted to mention the swing states. At this time in 2020, he was leading by 8. He ended up winning by 4.5. At this time in 2016, Hillary was leading by 4.5. She ended up winning by 2.1, winning the popular vote. So the fact that Trump is ahead in the polls, even in the last 2 elections, he was behind, should be very concerning for the Democrats. I wouldn't freak out if I were them, but it is something to keep in mind that Biden's numbers is sinking. And unfortunately, Trump and Biden, what has always been unique about them is whenever I look at Trump and I think like, wow, there's no way this guy could ever be elected. But then I look at Biden and I think, wow, there really is no way this guy could ever be elected. They're both, as everybody knows, they're just deeply unpopular candidates. And because of that, you kind of have a tug-of-war between the two. But my advice has always been, if you live in a safe state, vote with your heart. But if you live in a swing state, vote with your head. So I live in a swing state, so I'm going to need to vote with my head. Because if you're in a swing state and you vote for any candidate other than the two biggest ones, that's only going to be more likely the candidate you least like is going to win. So if you're a Biden support, if you're a Democrat and you vote for Kennedy or Stein as a protest, that's only going to make it more likely that Trump will win. If you're in a safe state, how you vote doesn't really matter for the presidency. However, there's always local elections. Biden's job approval, it's important to know, has been flat since 2022, the beginning of 2022. And of course, in Arizona, this was a notable poll by Rasmussen, which tends to lead toward Republicans, including Kennedy, Stein, and not including them, had Trump up by 7%. And it had Kennedy, Stein, and West, if you include them, was up by 4%. So that does make me think that Trump has a decent shot at winning Arizona. If I had to put my money on, I would say Trump is going to win in Arizona, which is not enough to change the White House, but it is. If Biden loses Arizona, then he could be in trouble. If Trump doesn't win Arizona, he's not going to be president. That's pretty safe to say. Alrighty, and then I have heard there's not too much new with the war in Israel, or in Israel and Gaza, but there is something I did want to put on people's radar that I didn't even hear, even though the news came out 2 weeks ago. There is going to be a speech to Congress by Benjamin Netanyahu on July 24th, which will probably be right before Congress goes into recess. His last speech was in 2015, and even that one was controversial. This will be on July 24th, right after the GOP convention, but before the Democratic one. The House Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrat from New York, and the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, who's also from New York, invited him to speak, but there was no formal encouragement from leadership to members, because lots of Democrats are considering skipping the speech, especially progressives. So we're going to hear more about that in the future. A lot of them are considering it. The big thing with the war in Gaza is usually foreign issues do not really impact elections. Because if you think about it, George H.W. Bush had a huge win in the Gulf War in 91. Yeah, he still lost in 92, and that was because of the domestic economy. And if you think Jimmy Carter, one of his biggest success was Camp David Accords. I think that's what they were called. Yet what brought him down was the economy. And then Trump, you could say he had some foreign policy successes, like with the USMCA, and he was able to meet with the dictator of North Korea. But, of course, the domestic economy is what brought him down, as well as COVID, which was part of the economy. So really the thing that makes presidents lose re-election, and if you notice in the last few years, has been the economy. So the economy, a lot of Americans... The economy on paper is doing all right. I am concerned about unemployment, which has been rising. I think I mentioned that in the last episode. Inflation did fall a little bit to 3.3% in May, which was down 0.1%, and prices were flat in April, or flat in May. And the interest rates have stayed the same. But it's really the feeling. Like, Americans don't feel it in their pocket. And I can sympathize with that, because I do feel that the economy has not really improved, yet on paper it has. So if although in politics perception is everything, so if people feel that a recession is coming or that we're in a recession, and a lot of people do, I should probably pull up the polling for that next episode, then that's really bad for Biden. Perception, as I said, perception is always key in politics, even if it's not actually true. And of course, bring this back to what I was talking about in Israel and Gaza, is that the hope for Biden is that this doesn't become a domestic issue. If the college campus protests stop, if there isn't as much anger on the streets, then it won't be a big issue. But if the campus protests resume when the schools open in August and September, if it only gets worse, which to be honest I think it will, then that's going to be a problem for Biden, because he's going to be squeezed on the left, because you're going to have people on the left who are not going to support him, and you're going to have people on the right who who are concerned about crime. They're going to say, oh, he's not tough enough on crime. He's letting the people run loose. So he's obviously, his administration wants this war to end. Yet he has to kind of have a careful balancing act, because if he doesn't support the war, then he's going to get attacked on the right. But if he supports it, he gets attacked on the left. And that's why Trump has the advantage here in the Middle East, because if he supports Israel, that plays to his base. Yeah, you have far-right people who are not going to like that, but they'll probably still support him anyway. And of course, if Trump doesn't need to have the support of the left, he's going to anger the left. But Biden needs the moderates, and a lot of moderate people in this country still support Israel. Alrighty. Oh yes, and it looks like the ceasefire deal has completely collapsed. The pressure of the Biden administration's been placing has not been working. They have been talking to Hamas separately. At least they have. Seems like they're doing that. They may have even openly admitted it. My guess is that Hamas is just trying to drag this out as long as possible. They're not. They want to try to wear down support for Israel as much as they can. So if I was Israel, I would try to end this war as soon as possible. Although if they do that, Benjamin Netanyahu's time as prime minister is probably going to be over. So he's incentivized to keep the war going as long as possible. However, fresh elections within the next year are incredibly likely. There's been talks about doing it at the beginning of next year in 2025. Alrighty. So I already mentioned the inflation news. I did want to mention, I don't really care so much about like abortion issues, but I did want to mention that the Supreme Court this week rejected a case which would have limited abortion access. The opinion was authorized by Chief Justice Kavanaugh, and he said the federal courts are the wrong forum for addressing the plaintiffs concerned about the FDA's actions. He suggested either going to the president and the FDA through the regulatory process, through Congress and the president through the legislative process, or the public through the political and electoral process. So what this would have done was this case would have prohibited, I believe the drug is called mifepristone. The question was whether to reverse a 2021 decision to allow the drug to be described through telemedicine, and it would have it would have overturned a 2016 decision to provide use of mifepristone up to 10 weeks instead of 7. Nothing has changed. Over 60% of abortions used this mifepristone because, as most people know, most abortions happen within the first trimester. This drug was approved by the FDA 24 years ago, and this is often used to circumvent abortion bans. Now, this was a unanimous decision, which I would say was a bit of a shock. In March, Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas referred to the Comstock Act of 1873, which bars the mailing of material intended for producing an abortion for any or for any indecent or immoral use, and that was passed in 1873. One thing I have noticed about the pro-life people is they really do, and I'm not saying whether I'm pro-life or pro-choice, is they really do rely on a lot of old laws from 150 to 200 years ago. Just saying. This law was never struck down, but it's not enforced. However, in their decision, no justice mentioned the 19th century law. The Supreme Court there's probably a bit of politics in this decision, because I think the Supreme Court, especially the right-wing justices, are a little bit hesitant about reigniting the abortion question again, although it's not like it's gone away, because they know in the midterms that really hurt Republicans and their chances. So they probably don't want to, conservative justices don't want to damage the chance of another Republican being president, because the best idea would be for Trump to come back, and then Alito and Thomas to step down, or definitely Thomas, because he's been on the court since the first Bush administration, and replace them with conservative justices, and that would cement a conservative majority for at least another decade, maybe 2 or 3. The liberal justices, this would be my advice if I was a political advisor, would be to get Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor, who Sotomayor has diabetes. They were both appointed during the during the Obama administration, to step down in a second Biden term, because if Biden has 4 years, we could have 8 years of another Republican after that. By then we would get to I don't even know what that would be, 2036, and who knows where things are going to be by then. It'll probably be best to have a new liberal Court justice from their point of view, because I think it would probably be bad to have 7 or even 8 conservative justices on the Supreme Court. That's just my opinion. Anyway, that's all we have to say for now. The next episode, which will come out, which will actually be, it'll still be before the debate. There's not much I have on my radar. I'll continue to monitor the polls. We won't talk about the polls every episode, but I'll definitely try and get an episode after the debate, but the debate won't be until the 27th, which will be in a week and a half anyway. So, anyway, I want to thank you for listening. Please give it a 5-star rating, share with your friends, family, all that good stuff, and I will see you all next time. Have a good one.